My name is Naima Omar. I'm an SWP member in South London, and I'm going to be chairing this rally. I hope everyone's had a great time, full of discussion and debates. We're going to have some great speakers this evening, who I'm going to introduce one by one. So, firstly, I would like to give a very warm welcome to our first speaker, Jasmine Schellin, Ginario Da Costa, who's the father of Edson Da Costa, who recently died in police custody. Would you like to come up there?
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's the first time I speak to the public. It's the first time.
Take your time too. Oh, dear. It's okay.
I'm really sad what happened to my son. My name is Ginario Da Costa. I'm coming from UK 21 years ago.
Take your time too.
I come with my boy. The nickname is Edson. Edson's a lovely boy. 20 to 25 years. And he passed away with the police arresting. Edson is passed away. He left one young child. Just 2 years ago. I'm very happy, I'm very sad. I'm going to say thank you to everybody, the community, people who helped him. People call me, tell me you need to come out and that we need to get justice. Thank you very much. And I believe in it. All these thank you guys say to me, all the welcome. I need you guys' support. I need help. Thank you.
Our second speaker, who I would like to introduce, is Brid Smith, who has come all the way from Ireland. She is a People Before Profits TD in the Irish Parliament.
All the way from Ireland is right. It's next door neighbours. After 800 years of tyranny and oppression, I've come over to see you. Somebody was asking me, well, several people asked me today, what's your new Prime Minister like? People may know we have a new Taoiseach, which is the equivalent of a Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar. He's gay, he's from mixed race background, he's handsome, he wears funny socks, he runs around the Phoenix Park with Prime Minister Trudeau, and he comes across as somebody new, vibrant, different, and he is, because we're used to having Taoiseach who are like, I suppose like Charlie Haughey or Enda Kenny, sort of cute culchies that don't really give the game away. But I'm afraid Leo Varadkar can't help himself, and he gives the game away all the time. He's a total and utter class snob, and he absolutely hates the poor. He got into his position as Taoiseach by conducting a campaign of hate against people who depend on social welfare payments. So he went after pensioners, he went after lone parents, he went after carers to try and make a case that these people are frauding Irish society, robbing the taxpayer, and are doing us all down. And of course, he turned his back completely on Apple, who owe the Irish taxpayer at least 13 billion, probably more like 19 billion, according to the European Union, and the Irish government have refused to take it, but instead are funding a very elaborate court case to appeal the ruling. Now, I can think of a few things, and I'm sure you could too, that we could do with 19 billion euro. Like, for example, house the homeless, get rid of the trolley crisis, fund education, give nurses proper pay. There's many, many things we could do with 19 billion. But this man chooses to go after the poorest, the most vulnerable, and in some cases, the ones who mostly need more than others. I mean, I could think of examples, but I won't waste your time here talking about it. He doesn't go after Bono. He doesn't go after his class who don't pay their taxes in Ireland. He goes after the poor. And even though it's not sort of apparent, there's a level of deep bitterness and resentment on things like this that are really being sown deep into the Irish working class. So last week, when it emerged that the waste management companies who collect our bins were being given new regulations to allow them to do what they like in terms of the charges, there was a near revolt inside Parliament and outside Parliament, because people said, enough is enough, we don't have it and we're not paying it, and it's the same corporations going after us again and again. They're scared stiff of the water movement, and they pulled back immediately from implementing that measure to trying to implement a different one from instead of the 1st July, the 1st of September. Scared stiff of the water movement. They're scared stiff of arisen people who are not willing to be put back in their box. And I think that the anger and resentment is there, but the hope is there. They also suffered a massive defeat when the Jobestown trial, the verdict came through that the people in the water protests in Jobestown were proven not guilty of false imprisonment. This was a major crisis for the government in Ireland. And they're on the back foot on the question of abortion rights. On International Women's Day this year, we had 2 major demonstrations in Dublin alone. There were demonstrations everywhere else. The first one was the strike for repeal, which was absolutely, utterly inspiring. And it linked in with a global action for abortion rights in Poland, in South America and elsewhere. And you saw I'm not joking, it was just like rivers of young people, young men and women, flowing through the city and holding it up for about 3 hours, blocking O'Connell Bridge and blocking the city and being absolutely, really defiant. And the same group marching to the Parliament later on. And of course, people will know from Mary giving the talk yesterday that abortion rights don't exist in Ireland because we have a very conservative and restrictive constitution, which has led to the deaths of women, literally led to the deaths of women and the torture of tens of thousands of others. And so the inspiration that young people are giving us to win this fight on abortion rights is really palpable, it is really tremendous. And it's been a really funny year for politics, because I think all of us probably woke up after the American election on this side of the planet, and your stomach sinks when you hear Trump was elected. But then you see the aftermath of it, and again, young people standing at airports to defend the Muslim community, standing, coming out on the streets in their droves to protest at Trump's racism. And then need I say, the inspiration that I think it really was Corbyn's election. Theresa May got a right kick in the face, and had Corbyn not published a manifesto and conducted a really serious social media campaign, Theresa May have been cock-a-hoop, but they did a brilliant job on providing, here is possibilities, here's an alternative, here is hope. And of course, that was again, tens of thousands of young people backing it up, rallying for it, doing the canvassing, etc. Young people have really been inspirational in all of these struggles, and these struggles in turn have given hope to all of us wherever we are. This morning I went to Panos' meeting on Greece, and the detail he gave on the fourth wave of austerity attacks was really just shocking. How much they're going after pensioners again. I don't know how these old people are actually living. They've gone after them 3 times. They're coming after them a 4th time with cuts of 20 to 30%. They're going after the lowest paid workers and beginning to take taxes from them. How people survive in these situations is beyond me. And these people have been the most generous, the most open to the victims of Fortress Europe who are drowning every day on the Mediterranean Sea. So I think we're living in a period of deep anger, resentment, bitterness, austerity indeed, but the hope and the possibilities that emerge from campaigns that are being conducted throughout the world. Grenfell, I'm sure, having been a major tragedy, will also release lots of hopes and possibilities around campaigning on a basic issue like housing, and to stop what people today called social cleansing, which they're attempting to do everywhere. So there's a role for us, and why we're all at Marxism and why we come here year after year and organise our branches and organise in our communities is because revolutionary ideas must be inserted inside that hope and possibility. On their own, reformism will not change capitalism. It will not deliver the real changes that are needed to challenge the deep state, that are needed to really take on the system at its heart. And we stand on the shoulders of giants. By God, we do. And 100 years ago this year, we saw the Great Russian Revolution. We'll be celebrating it later in the year. But remember, comrades, our ideas matter. We take them serious, they're clear, they're well thought out, they have the lessons of history behind them, and we can speak to millions of people. We can literally make a difference through campaigning, through being on the streets, to working with people. They're not all revolutionaries, of course, but they want ideas and they want to know how to change the world. So the last thing I'd just say to you is before I finish, I'll leave you sit down. I didn't buy one of your get rid of or kick out the Tories badges because you haven't got the DUP on it.
Our next speaker needs no introduction, and most welcome back, Moazzam Begg, a former prisoner of Guantanamo Bay and the outreach director of CAGE.
Thank you very much for that underwhelming response. I just turned 49 the other day, but just to let you know that I'm up with it and I'm still, in tune with modern technology. Now let's start. In all honesty, laughs aside, and it's wonderful that we can laugh and that we can cry simultaneously. That's the amazing thing about us as people. Our vast array of emotions, which I'm feeling right now. And I felt the moment that Ginario Da Costa got up and spoke. I don't know who you are. I've never met you. I didn't even know about your son's case until I saw it on Rob Ferguson's Facebook. And I was shocked. And it broke my heart, not just to hear this story, but to see you stand up and speak. Because it reminded me of my father. My father, who campaigned for me when I was in Guantanamo. And he stood in front of audiences like this, sometimes struggling to get the right words out, sometimes not knowing what to say or how to say it, except it was his heart that spoke. And the heart connects to the heart. And that's what happened just now. People stood up and clapped. We could have just all stayed quiet, and we would have felt the same thing. We would have felt that man's emotion and felt what he's going through. Which father should ever have to bury his child? Who? But not just at the hands of ordinary society, but at the hands of those who are supposed to protect society. I'm telling you now from my own experience, the authorities, my own authorities in this country, the US authorities, their military, their police, their intelligence services, who are supposed to protect us, have been complicit, hand in glove, in abusing people's rights, in sometimes killing, in sometimes torture, in sometimes extraordinary rendition, when our taxes have gone towards paying them to ensure that people like your son are protected. And so that is what I felt. And what I also felt from the response of the people here is that you've been welcomed into a community, welcomed to people. And their arms are opened towards you and embracing you because you are now one of us. You always were one of us. You always were. But there was nothing worse than a tragedy like that for us to recognize it. I'm going to quickly touch on some of the things that have happened in relation to we are in a position here right now. I remember last year speaking here at the opening rally, and you also gave me an underwhelming response then too. And I've marked it. Nonetheless, we spoke about the targeting of Jeremy Corbyn and how it'd been called think about this. The guy who could potentially become the Prime Minister of this country, and hope he does, has been called a terrorist sympathizer. More times than I have. He's been called a threat to national security by a woman who brings in the DUP. to power share. And think about this, the DUP, whose former leader was once a guy called Peter Robinson, who stood on a platform once after they'd taken over a police station and said, the only response we have to the troubles we face, we have to deal with a stick of dynamite to resolve it. So these are the people now who are going to be determining what is and what isn't an extremist. Exactly. Exactly. Another thing that got a laugh was Brid Smith, our Irish friend who just spoke. And I asked her, we've been told often in Britain about conforming to British values, and if you don't conform to British values, you're an extremist. And I asked her, do you have a sense of what Irish values are? And she said, essentially, what the hell are you talking about? And I don't know whether that's her Irish stoicism or whether it's just the reality. If you were to ask anybody else, say in Finland, or say in Lithuania, or say in Guatemala, or any of these other countries that make up the world that we are also part of, though you wouldn't know it living in Britain. What are their values? Are your values better than anybody else's? And more importantly, can you define them? Because our government, past or present, has been unable to do so. Yet it wants to teach them and impose them upon us and say that if you don't conform to these values, these universal values that we can't define, then you're an extremist. So we're still waiting for that definition, but more importantly, they're trying to bring in a law. You know, they've brought in law after law after law in this country. 14 pieces of anti-terror legislation since 2000. And still, you know, after all of this legislation, after 2 wars to stop terrorism, we have the greatest threat that this country has had in all recent times. And so the question has to be, including the PREVENT program, including all of the anti-terror legislation, including all of the wars, how come we are less safe now than we have ever been in recent history? The answer is because of the Tory government, and I have to say, in the past, New Labour under Tony Blair. But what I see in front of me and repeatedly see, I stood on this platform here in 2010 with a man called Jerry Conlon, who'd been in prison for 16 years for a crime he didn't commit. And the same police who was supposed to protect society made up the evidence, concocted the evidence, held back exculpatory evidence that could have stopped him from rotting in prison, as well as the Maguire 7 and the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4 and all of them. And he stood here with me to recount his story. Many years, decades later, as if it had happened to him just the day before. And in between us was a woman called Gareth Pearce, our lawyer, and she connected these 2 conflicts that Britain has had to deal with, the Irish troubles and now the Muslim troubles. And she told me once before, in 1998, she said, Moazzam, it was the Irish first, but I can guarantee you, you are next. And she was right. But what I see here in front of me are people who recognize all of that, who've been part of the pushback, who, despite all of the mudslinging towards a man like Corbyn, still support him in spite of the fact of him being called a threat to national security and a terrorist apologist. You see, once you've got past the labels and recognized that historically speaking, the most respected man on the planet in recent times was a convicted terrorist called Nelson Mandela. And today, I just walked past. And if you had any doubt about it, I just walked past his statue today in Parliament Square. So these labels, they mean nothing. While we're on the subject, radicalization, we're made to believe now that we've got programs to stop radicalization because radicalization is bad. Who the hell ever said that? Who the hell ever agreed with radicalization being bad? We can have negative and positive radicalization. Were the suffragettes and what they fought for the right for the women to vote in their radical opposition to the government of the day, were they terrorists? Do we believe that what they did was wrong? Was Mandela wrong? Was Muhammad Ali wrong? Was Malcolm X wrong? Was Martin Luther King wrong? Is the list that we present here, all of these people were wrong, because if it was the status quo that remained, all of those people would have remained in prison or hanged or worse. So I'm all for radicalization when it's positive. I'm all for radicalization against racists. I'm all for radicalization against those who would destroy our basic rights, as they've been attempting to do. You know, I wrote a whole load of notes, but because I can't read my own writing, I've actually just made all of this up as I went along. And I'm probably just going to end there and simply just say that the final thing I would say, there's a lot of us who are struggling out there. Islamophobia is rife. Racism is rife. The attitudes against the poor, as you've seen in Grenfell Tower, are rife. But what we have seen is an outpouring of support. Different creeds, different colors, different cultures, different backgrounds, different faiths and none, all coming together, recognizing one another's struggles. That's really important, that we recognize one another's struggles. And if we can't, if we feel too afraid from the authorities because of whatever they're threatening with us, then at least support those who do stand up, because it's on your shoulders that some of us can stand. And if you pull yourselves away, we fall. So we require your support, we require your help, and we require your response, like us, to be one of resistance and standing firm in the face of oppression. Thank you very much.
Without further ado, I would like to welcome our last speaker, Amy Leather, the Joint National Secretary of SWP and the organizer of Marxism Festival.
Well, yeah, first of all, as one of the organisers of Marxism Festival, I actually want to say a massive thank you to all the people who made it happen, to the speakers. I mean, what a privilege it is again, really, to be here with Moazzam, Begg and Brid Smith, and also the family of Edson Da Costa, who've joined us today. Thank you. And there are also many people who play a big part in making sure Marxism runs smoothly. In particular, the people in red T-shirts, the team, without whom Marxism couldn't happen. You know, a big clap. And the other person with whom Marxism couldn't happen without is Monica Axon and the creche workers who run that, and they're here today as well, so thank you. And actually, a massive thank you from me to all the people behind the scenes who prepare for the event, because all the planning for this event has taken place during really a momentous time, a time of political turmoil and upheaval when all the old certainties of political life and the norms have been turned upside down. I mean, that general election has changed everything. I mean, how different things looked when Theresa May called the snap general election less than 3 months ago. Just remember the arrogance of the Tories, their confidence. Not only would they increase their majority, but they'd do it by a landslide and finish off Corbyn. Well, what a reversal of fortune. What a difference a few weeks can make. Because that election result was an absolute humiliation for Theresa May, now a hated figure. Not just by millions of us, but by her own party. Imprisoned in Downing Street because they've got no one else to replace her with, forced to abandon her manifesto pledges, and now desperately clinging to power by buying votes. Buying the votes of the bigots of the DUP, a party which, as Moazzam says, have actual links to terrorism, who stand against abortion rights, against a woman's right to choose, and against LGBT plus rights. And you know what? If they ever want to lecture us about democracy, then let's ask, how is it right that a party that has just got 10 MPs, that won less than 300,000 votes in total, is now essentially in a government coalition, propping up the Tories and able to shape government policy? But the election result challenged all the political certainties we've been led to believe, because Jeremy Corbyn, he defied all the odds, and Labour won the biggest increase in popular support during a campaign in British electoral history, and it did so on the basis of left-wing policies and mass mobilisation. Who says now that Britain is a right-wing country? You know, Corbyn tapped into the anger, the mass feeling that exists against austerity and against inequality, racism and war, and he inspired people with the message, things could be different, there is an alternative. In fact, it shows just how out of touch not only the Tories are, but that whole political class, the pundits, the commentators, the newspaper columnists, who all had to admit they were wrong the day after the election. But wasn't that hard to see? the rage brewing in British society. I mean, we saw a glimpse of it last year, didn't we, with the vote to leave the EU. Remember that Diane Abbott described it as a roar of defiance against the establishment. But, you know, if you really want to understand the sort of class anger that drove such a vote for Corbyn, then look no further than Grenfell Tower. That burned-out building where so many people lost their lives. I mean, we haven't even been told the final death toll. Because that fire sums up everything that is rotten, corrupt and brutal about austerity in life in Tory Britain, where for decades council housing has been sold off to greedy developers, where social cleansing has pushed the poor out of rich neighbourhoods, where regeneration is about how an area looks to the rich rather than meeting housing needs, where health and safety is disregarded, costs are cut, fire services slashed, and the poor are left to burn. No wonder that the grief and the sorrow turned to rage and defiance when those militant protests hit the streets in the days after the fire, because this was not some terrible but natural disaster. This was corporate murder, and those who committed it should be held to account. And we know who they are. Let's think of who we can hold to account. Those previous Tory housing ministers, like Gavin Barwell, who blocked a report warning of fire risks in tower blocks, or Brandon Lewis, who opposed making sprinkler systems compulsory. Or how about Boris Johnson, who during his time as London Mayor sacked over 550 firefighters and slashed £100 million from the London fire budget alone. We know who they are. We know who should be in the frame. But they're not hard to find. But I don't see any dawn raids or police banging down their doors and making arrests of them. So it's right to rage. It's right to march on the streets and fight for justice. But, you know, it's not just those individuals who should be held to account. The glare of that horrific fire illuminates the whole system for us all to see. That burned-out tower of Grenfell, it stands like a monument to capitalism, a system that puts profit before people, a system that would even make flammable cladding for tower blocks in the first place. I mean, why would you even do that? You'd only do it because it's cheaper and you care more about profit than anything else. And so Grenfell, it shines a light on the reality of capitalism, and it exposes that brutal class division at the heart of the system where working class people are treated with contempt. It's not an exception to capitalism, it's the consequence of such a system. And so we have to use the sorrow, the fury, the defiance that we saw on the streets after the fire, which fused with the anger and hatred of the Tories and Theresa May. We have to use it to demand the answers about that fire, but also something more, to get rid of this system, get rid of such a class society that condemns working class people to live and die in this way. And we have to do that because, you know, there are those who seek to direct the blame in a different direction. You know, some newspapers, like The Sun, focused on an Ethiopian refugee whose fridge they claim started the fire. I mean, what scum that paper is, The Sun. I mean, just like they tried to blame the Liverpool fans for what happened at Hillsborough when 96 people were killed, they want to blame the victims at Grenfell. Well, they should learn, shouldn't they? They should learn, because even if you have the collusion of the whole establishment, the police, the politicians, the media, the truth comes out, just like it did over Hillsborough, where last year, fresh inquests found that none of the fans were to blame and the 96 people were unlawfully killed. And now, 28 years later, the former Chief Superintendent, David Duckenfeld, the match commander on the day, will stand in the dock, charged with manslaughter. But you know, we should also learn. We should also learn, because it wasn't automatic. It was fought for. It was fought for by people like Sheila Coleman, who spoke here yesterday at Marxism and the justice campaigns. Because without their relentless campaigning, there will be no justice. And whether it's Grenfell or Hillsborough, the lesson is what we do matters. And if we're going to fight, not just for justice, but over austerity, pay and inequality, We cannot let our side be divided. Because, it's not just the Sun or the Daily Mail who blame refugees or try and scapegoat all migrants and demonise Muslims. It comes from the top of society. Not a surprise, really. How best to deflect anger away from yourself, but to blame others? Just remember, it was Theresa May who, after the terrible attack in London Bridge during the election campaign, she said we were too tolerant of extremism. And by this, she didn't mean right-wing Nazi extremism, where, perhaps she might have the point. There's been far too much tolerance of Britain First, the EDL, rump Nazi organisations by the authorities. No, we were too tolerant of Islamic extremism. And instead, she said we would need to have some difficult and embarrassing conversations. Now, she doesn't mean let's have some difficult and embarrassing conversations about the role of the British state in invading and brutally occupying other countries like Iraq, where 1 million people were killed. She doesn't mean about Palestinians forced from their homes, denied the right of return by a state backed by the West. She doesn't mean let's talk about Britain's arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which are used to kill and enforce starvation in Yemen. She doesn't mean let's talk about Syria, where Western bombs add to the plight of people bombed into who've already been bombed too much. She doesn't mean that. She means let's have some racist conversations. In particular, let's have some racist conversations about Muslims. And when she says that, she is giving a green light to all those who don't just want to have a conversation, they translate it into attacks. The attacks on Muslim women that we've seen, the attacks that have increased where acid is thrown in the face of Muslims, or like the attacks at Finsbury Park. And it's not just May, it's Trump, the President of the United States. I mean, one of his flagship policies is to ban Muslims from travelling to America. I mean, not content with ripping up environmental protection, taking the US out of the Paris Agreement to limit carbon emissions and putting us on course to catastrophic climate change, not content with ordering cruise missile strikes on Syria, he wants to now stop any people fleeing war or climate change from seeking refuge in the US, and not only that, banning all Muslims from travelling there completely. But the response was brilliant, wasn't it? When hundreds of thousands of us demonstrated earlier this year, not only in London, but across the country, in towns and cities, against Trump, black and white, Muslim, Jew, gay, straight, women and men, we stood up to be counted at that point, and those protests are a legacy of the movements we've built against war and racism over the years, and they show the sort of movement we need more of. And we're going to have to do the same again. If Donald Trump dares to step foot in this country as he keeps threatening to do, we have to be ready to get on the streets in our thousands. Because we don't forget those refugees still drowning in the Mediterranean, and we are very clear. We should open our borders and welcome people fleeing war, persecution and poverty. And not only that, we are against all immigration controls. There should be complete freedom of movement for everyone, whether they're EU workers from Eritrea, from Syria or from Sudan. And that is why building Stand Up to Racism matters. We need to go from Marxism Festival with renewed resolve to work with others in Stand Up to Racism to widen and deepen it. We need to ensure, in the wake of attacks like that in Manchester and London, that we fight for unity, that we call the vigils and raise the slogan, "Don't let the racists divide us," because there are those that seek to do otherwise. The Nazis, the BNP, the EDL, they may be a rump. UKIP may have been destroyed by the election, but we're not complacent. We have to oppose the Nazis wherever they try and march, and we have to deal with new formation, like that of the Football Lads Alliance, where far-right racists try and pull layers around them on the streets under the guise of no to terror and hatred, but in reality, preaching Islamophobia. We have to oppose every attack, whether that's against Muslims on the streets or at the hands of the police, like Edson Da Costa, yet another black man to die in police custody. And all of this means building Stand Up to Racism groups in every area and making sure that the Stand Up to Racism conference on Saturday, the 21st of October, is as big as possible. Sign up now, sign up others. We need to make that as big as we can. But we don't want to just be on the defensive. We actually want to go on the offensive against the Tories, don't we? I mean, they're in crisis. The Prime Minister has no mandate, and actually, that vote for Corbyn means our side has a brilliant advantage. The question is, how do we press that home? How do we increase the pressure on May and the Tories, not only to drive them from office, but to end all their policies, from the pay freeze to the cuts? Well, I tell you what, you don't increase the pressure by calling off action, like the TUC did last week when it's cancelled its Britain Needs a Pay Rise Day of Action. Now is the time to fight over pay. The Tories have been exposed. They found the money. They found the money, didn't they, the magic money tree, to pay the DUP £1 billion. Why can't they give a decent pay rise to the heroes of Grenfell, the firefighters and nurses and all the other public sector workers? We need more action right now, not less. We need more demonstrations, like the People's Assembly one last Saturday, when 100,000 people marched through London, and we need them to be bigger. John McDonnell called for 1 million people to march against May and the Tories, and he's right. We need to make that a reality when the Tories come to Manchester for their conference in the autumn. Sunday, the 1st of October. Put it in your diaries now. That's the day the People's Assembly have called a demo in Manchester to surround the Tory party conference. And we have to leave this hall and get organised. Get organised over the summer, organise the coaches, get trade union support, involve every campaign, housing, education, health, anti-cuts groups, go to your local Labour Party group, go to Momentum groups and get them to be on those coaches with you, because we want to bring thousands to Manchester to bring it to a standstill when the Tories are in town. But you see, these struggles are very important, because they are not just to get rid of May and the Tories, but they're also about shaping what comes after. What happens if Jeremy Corbyn is elected on a left-wing manifesto and starts to try and implement it? Will the media, the bosses, the rich, and all those at the top of society say, yeah, OK, that's democracy, the people have spoken, that's fine, we'll pay more tax? Or Richard Branson, who unleashed a media storm on Corbyn when he just tweeted a photograph of himself sitting on a crowded Virgin train. Will he say, OK, take back the railways into public ownership? And will their opposition just be limited to a few nasty headlines in the Daily Mail? Of course not. They're going to organise against Corbyn. They're going to organise against the left-wing Labour government, and they're going to use all the means at their disposal. They'll use the financial markets. Remember the pressures brought down in Syriza in Greece by the European Central Bank. We may be leaving the EU, we're not leaving the international finance markets. And if those means fail, then they've been quite clear about what they could do. Remember the Army General who threatened a mutiny if Corbyn was elected. All of the forces of the state will be unleashed against him. And the power to resist this won't come from inside Parliament. I mean, actually, we know there are sections of the Labour Party MPs who'll probably be on the side of those undermining Corbyn. Instead, we have to match the power of capital, the power of the state, with a counterpower. And that's the power of workers. When they're organised, not only on the streets, but in the workplace, when we act collectively, stopping work, going on strike, stopping profits being made, hitting capitalism at its heart, and throwing up new forms of self-organisation. This is why we in the Socialist Workers' Party, we support Corbyn. We're going to fight absolutely for his victory. But we're not in the Labour Party. We organise separately and independently with a strategy of increasing the struggles outside Parliament. But we also, it's because we have a vision. We don't just want to get rid of the Tories or get Corbyn elected as Prime Minister. We want to completely destroy capitalism. We're fighting for a different world, a socialist world where racism, sexism, homophobia are things of the past. Above all else, where things like Grenfell will never happen because people would become before profit. If you agree with that vision, if you agree with the strategy we've put forward of how we can increase struggle, then join us. Join us today in that fight. Join the Socialist Worker Party.